So we'd like to welcome everyone. For those of you who maybe are new to the Deschutes River Alliance, for the last decade, we spent studying the river and an effort to protect and preserve the river. And our advocacy is all driven by this science, and our science is actually used by DEQ for the reporting to EPA. We have equipment continuously monitoring the lower river for parameters such as dissolved oxygen, pH levels, and temperature. And then we write an annual water quality report, all of which you can find on our website. And tonight, what we're going to do is have kind of an overview of where the river is and what can be done to help fix the river. So at the end of the presentation, there will be time for questions. If you think of questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat feature to put your questions in there, and then we'll circle back and get to those. This evening, we're going to hear from three men. Rick Hafele, who is one of our board members and has a long history in water quality with the Department of Environmental Quality. Anybody that knows Rick also knows of his love of bugs and hatches, and he'll cover some of that this evening also. Steve Pribyl, also a board member, has spent his career as a fish biologist for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And he knows pretty much every rock on the river because he spent probably more time on that river studying fish than anybody else around. And both of them have been with the DRA since the very beginning. And then Derek Miller is our water quality coordinator. He comes into the role with background in natural resource management, which has ranged from working with state and federal fishery management agencies to the private sector managing freshwater lake and pond ecosystems. So with that, I am going to go ahead and, we're going to have a few technical issues every once in a while, I'm afraid, but bear with us as we all make Zoom work for this. And I'm going to pass it off to Derek here in a moment.
Go back. Cool. I think I have control here. All right. So like Sarah said, my name is Derek Miller. I'm the water quality coordinator for the Deschutes River Alliance. Like Sarah already mentioned, just note that this presentation is being recorded, and save your questions for the end. We got a lot of really good stuff to cover. So I'm going to start things off by giving a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So to get things started off, I'm going to discuss key findings from the DRA's own water quality data and the available data record. I'm also going to give a brief timeline of what's happened in the Lower Deschutes River with respect to the Selective Withdrawal Tower and the changes that we've seen in water quality as a result. Rick Hafele is then again going to dive into water quality and how it's changed as a result of tower operations. We're going to be focusing on three really important water quality parameters that serve as indicators of overall river health. They are temperature, pH, and dissolved oxygen. Rick's then going to discuss how the decline in these water quality parameters have affected in the invertebrate and algal communities. And then Steve Pribyl will cover how this decline in water quality has affected fish health and reintroduction. I'll finish things up to discuss what can be done to address these problems from both a larger management perspective, in addition to what you as an individual can do to advocate for the Lower Deschutes River. Having some trouble with controlling the screen here, so apologies, but all right, so I'm going to dive into key findings. So the available data record, including the Deschutes River Alliance's own water quality data, shows that first and foremost, water quality has declined in the Lower Deschutes River, unfortunately, following selective withdrawal tower operations. And And as a result of this decline in water quality, we have seen an increase in the number of violations of water quality standards set to protect aquatic life. Now, agencies responsible for enforcing water quality standards, principally the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, has not done their job to enforce these water quality standards and violations. And unfortunately, as a direct result of this, the Lower Deschutes River has suffered, and negative consequences have included shifts in the algal and macroinvertebrate species communities, as well as contributions to the lack of improvement to fish returns and anadromous reintroduction being unsuccessful. So real quickly, here I'm going to cover this map of the Deschutes Basin for those who may not be familiar with it. So the Lower Deschutes River, I'm going to turn on my laser pointer here. So Lower Deschutes River is formed by three tributaries: the Crooked River, the Middle Deschutes River, and the Metolius River. Three dams and reservoirs are now between these three tributaries and the Lower Deschutes River. The first is Lake Billy Chinook, which is formed by Round Butte Dam, and water is released from Round Butte Dam now from the Selective Withdrawal Tower. The second reservoir is Lake Semtustus, which is formed by Pelton Dam, and the last reservoir is the re-regulating dam, which is formed by the re-reg dam. Now, whatever water flows from the Selective Withdrawal Tower essentially is the water that's composed of the Lower Deschutes River. And this is because the residence times of the water in Lake Semtustus and the re-regulating reservoir is relatively short. All right, so now I'm just going to go over a brief timeline and overview of what's happened in the Lower Deschutes with respect to the three dam complex and the Selective Withdrawal Tower. So prior to 1964, which is when the three dam complex was finished, all of the water entering the Lower Deschutes River was proportional to whatever flows was coming in from its three tributaries. Following completion of the dam in 1964, this all changed. So from 1964 to 2009, all of the water released into the Lower Deschutes River was from the bottom of Lake Billy Chinook. And this is important because this water is primarily composed and is still composed of primarily cool, clean water sourced primarily from the Metolius River. Fish passage was obviously an issue after the three dams were installed. And after passage efforts, including what was at the time the world's longest fish ladder failed, Round Butte Fish Hatchery was ultimately created as a mitigation measure. So fast forward to 2005, and the operating license for the three dam project had to be renewed. So project operators, which are Portland General Electric and the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, applied for a new license with utilizing Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and FERC issued their new license in 2005. Now, as part of this new license, and in addition to the Clean Water Act, there were two requirements required of the project. First was improving water quality in the Lower Deschutes River, and the second was restoring fish passage as part of the new license. And the Selective Withdrawal Tower is actually the intended solution to both of these things. But unfortunately, since the tower was completed in 2009 all the way to the present, unfortunately, opposite has actually been the case, particularly with water quality component. And this has to do with the fact that the Selective Withdrawal Tower takes the majority surface water for much of the year. And once again, so this is due to thermal stratification, where the warmer water sits on top, and the surface water being taken from the surface of the reservoir is primarily sourced from the Crooked River, which is generally more polluted than the other two tributaries. This decline in water quality of water being released into the Lower Deschutes has resulted in an increase in water quality violations of standards set to protect aquatic life. And unfortunately, trouble here. Here we go. Unfortunately, regulatory agencies have not done their job to address this issue. So Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ, is responsible for enforcing Oregon's water quality standards. And like I just mentioned, the number of violations of these standards has increased following tower operations. But unfortunately, instead of enforcement, a series of interim agreements that have relaxed water quality requirements set by the original license given in 2005 has become the norm. We'll get into these interim agreements a little bit more in the presentation and the water quality portion. Another failing of DEQ is the new license issued in 2005 also tasked DEQ to establish what are called a total maximum daily load for pollutants entering the Lower Deschutes River. This is required because the Lower Deschutes is listed as water quality impaired. And TMDLs are a really important first step in improving water quality in impaired watersheds because they determine the maximum amount of pollutants that can enter a watershed in order to have healthy water quality. We'll get into the details of these water quality parameters later on, but just know for now that the Lower Deschutes River is listed as impaired for elevated pH and temperature and low dissolved oxygen. The Crooked River is listed as impaired for elevated pH and temperature, just like the Lower Deschutes. And it's also listed for biocriteria. And essentially that means that macroinvertebrates like aquatic insects are not at the healthy levels that they should be. Sorry, I'm gonna backtrack real quick. Remember that Crooked River is important because the amount of Crooked River water entering the Lower Deschutes following tower operations has increased dramatically to where now there's a disproportionate amount of Crooked River water entering the Lower Deschutes River. Both of these watersheds were listed as impaired for temperature in 1998. For the rest of the parameters, it was around the early 2000s that they were listed. So DEQ has had decades to come up with a TMDL and have not done so. All right, so now here I'm going to cover, this is just a photo of the Selective Withdrawal Tower, and in a second I'll show you a diagram just to give you all an idea of what it looks like and what its original intended purpose was. So this black arrow is pointing to the above water portion of the Selective Withdrawal Tower. This photo was taken above Round Butte Dam, so showing Lake Billy Chinook. And this is a diagram of the tower itself in its entirety. And like I mentioned previously, the tower was the intended solution for the requirements of the new license given in 2005 for improving water quality and restoring fish passage. And so for the fish passage component, the tower was intended to create a surface current in order to attract out-migrating juvenile salmonids. And if the laser pointer is going to work for me here, let's see. Here's the entrance there of the surface draw. So passage has been and continues to be an issue for juvenile salmonids in the upper watershed because juvenile salmon often they get lost in Lake Billy Chinook, and since such a big reservoir, they don't know which way is downstream. So the surface draw was intended to create a surface current to attract them and then collect them, transport them around the 3 dams. So this was a good idea in theory, but it has not been as effective as intended. And this is shown by the lack of improvement in fish returns since tower operations started. And an unintended consequence of this dramatic increase in surface draw has been increase in warm nutrient-laden surface water being directly released into the Lower Deschutes for much of the year. So on a typical year, usually there's 100% surface draw from November to May. And this has caused, like I mentioned, poor water quality, which has resulted in a plethora of unfortunate consequences in the ecosystem. So the Deschutes River Alliance contends that these negative consequences do not support the continued tower operations as they have been. Another thing I want to mention real quick while we're on this slide, once again, my laser pointer isn't working. Here we go. But there seems to be there's undisclosed limitations to tower operations to where now there is only a maximum bottom draw of 60%. So even if full bottom draw is maximized, there's always a certain portion of surface water being released into the Lower Deschutes River. And with that, I believe I'm switching it over to Rick, who's going to dive into the details of water quality in the Lower Deschutes.
All right, thank you, Derek. I'm gonna see if I get control of the screen here. Click to start remote. Let's see if this is working. Not getting anywhere yet, Sarah. Okay. Oh, is that me or you? Oh, now maybe it's working. Yeah, there we go. All right, I've got control of the screen. My name's Rick Hafele, and Sarah's already made a little introduction for myself. I've probably met a number of you out there, but thanks everyone for showing up tonight. We've got quite a bit of interesting information to cover. As Sarah mentioned, I spent most of my career, professional career, working for DEQ. During that time, I was manager of the biomonitoring program, and before I retired, I was manager of the statewide water monitoring program. And I like to think I've been on most watersheds in Oregon over my career, and it's one of the lucky things I can look back on. I've been on the Deschutes River Alliance's board since it started in 2013, and tonight I'm going to go through some of the key aspects of the water quality work we've been doing there and what it's been telling us. So I'm going to dive right in. As Derek's already alluded to, surface water from Lake Billy Chinook releasing that water has made the Lower Deschutes water quality worse. And it's primarily because it's warmed the water temperature in the Lower Deschutes, and it's releasing excess nutrients from the surface of Lake Billy Chinook into the Lower Deschutes as well. And that's stimulating excess algal growth in the lower river. And if any of you are fishermen, which I suspect many of you are, you know how challenging it is to wade on that slippery algal growth out there. And that's just an indicator of the problems that are occurring. The other negative effects of this, though, are really shown in the water quality data due to changes in the pH, which is the hydrogen ion concentration in the water. And we'll talk about that in some detail here in a minute. Also, changes in the dissolved oxygen that aren't good. And there's been consummate changes in the macroinvertebrate and fish communities, in particular the aquatic invertebrates. Let's see here. And just a quick note here, Sarah's already mentioned that the data that we collect has been used by DEQ in their reports to EPA on water quality conditions in the lower river. So we've been using the same protocol for collecting our data, the same kinds of equipment that DEQ uses for their data sampling as well. Myself and Larry Marks, are another board member who worked at DEQ for many years, have applied the same kinds of protocols. So the data we're collecting is really quite good and meets all of DEQ's data quality standards. Okay, let's move on. There's been quite a bit of talk, if you've been following any of this, over temperature management in the Lower Deschutes River. And we feel that a number of claims being made really aren't supported by the data. So for example, PG has claimed that they've created the natural thermal regime now in the Lower Deschutes River. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit here. And that this new temperature regime has been good for aquatic life in the river. And that if they release more bottom water earlier in the year, they're going to run out of cold bottom water in Lake Billy Chinook. So let's take a look at some of these claims. The natural thermal regime idea is an interesting one. It sounds great. Everyone would like to see something natural occurring, of course. But we would argue that, in fact, it's not natural, the conditions that they're creating in the Lower Deschutes. For one thing, releasing 100% surface water, which is primarily Crooked River water, for 90% of the year, for 9 months of the year anyway, really isn't natural. If dams weren't there, they'd be releasing a fully mixed amount of Crooked River and Deschutes and Metolius River water downstream, but that's not happening. The other reason that there's issues with this, or we have issues with this, is that the temperature that they're releasing into the Lower Deschutes is a temperature that they control based on how much water they blend from the surface port that they have, and there's a port near the bottom of the reservoir, and they can blend the surface water with bottom water. And they blend this based on a model that was created as they were researching this new tower and how they're going to operate it. And it's based on the 7-day maximum temperature of the 3 tributaries coming into Lake Billy Chinook, the Crooked River, the Deschutes, and the Metolius. So they have thermographs on the mouths of these 3 rivers before they enter Lake Billy Chinook, and they look at the hourly temperatures, and they calculate what the 7-day maximum is, and they use that to determine what temperature is going to be released into the lower Deschutes. So they're actually maximizing the temperature that they're going to release into the lower river. So this is not at all what we would think of as a natural temperature regime. And we think they're doing this so they can maximize the amount of bottom water, I'm sorry, not the bottom water, the amount of surface water they release to create a strong current across the reservoir to attract the juveniles moving downstream. The other thing is that this model, they needed to look at some pre-dam data to try and come up with what they might feel is natural conditions. And there's not a lot of data that was around before the dams were built in the early 1960s. And the data that they were using was primarily from 1955 to 1958. So this is the baseline information that they used to develop this model. And it's really not something that we would consider natural. It's kind of problematic for several reasons. Primarily is that in the mid-50s was a period of time in Oregon when there were very few controls on water quality, on water management and land use management. And we had some of the worst water quality conditions in the state in the 40s through the 50s. And it was really for that reason that in the 60s, the Oregon legislature created what became DEQ, and Clean Water Act was passed in '72. So we had some of the worst water quality conditions at that time. So it's not necessarily what you'd want to look at to determine what might be best conditions to have as natural today. The other thing, of course, is that they're managing to the highest possible temperature now by using this 7-day maximum model of the tributaries coming into the reservoir. And this is resulting in excessive warming in the lower Deschutes River, warming that could be reduced by releasing more bottom water. And it's causing significant changes in aquatic insect life cycles and species composition, which I'll be talking about shortly. And oh, what happened here? Not moving. Come on. I lost control. Who did it go to? There we go. And increased algal growth is also occurring as a result of the higher temperature. And it's also affecting fish use in the lower Deschutes, particularly in the area near the mouth of smallmouth bass have moved upstream into the lower Deschutes River further than they've ever been seen before. And Steve Pribyl will be talking about this in some detail. And also other fish concerns are the increase in some parasites, particularly black spot in red band trout and Ceratodonova shasta, which is an important and serious parasite and pathogen of Chinook salmon that Steve will talk more about. Okay, let's move forward. This graph is something that I'm going to go through here, hopefully not take too long to explain. If you see this horizontal line right at 0 going across there, think of this as the baseline of the maximum temperature that existed in the lower Deschutes before the tower existed. This is based on 21 years of data that was averaged through the season. And so this is kind of ground zero of baseline temperatures in the lower Deschutes prior to the tower. The other part of the graph in the red and the blue is the difference that's now occurring after the tower started operating in maximum temperature and minimum temperature when they're lowering it since the tower started operating. So the red indicates how much warming has occurred through the seasons, and the blue indicates where it's being cooled. And you can see it, there's some cooling occurring in the late summer and fall. And this is one of the things that PG is pointing out, is that they're saving the cold water early in the year so they can cool the Lower Deschutes River in the fall, in the late summer and fall. But if you notice, the amount of cooling that's occurring is just a little over 0.5 degrees centigrade, which is about 1 degree Fahrenheit. Whereas you look at the amount of warming that's occurring through the winter, spring, and early summer, it's quite significant, over 2.5 degrees centigrade, which is about 4 degrees Fahrenheit at its peak. So this much warming is occurring through the year versus this little bit of cooling. So this is the effect that the tower is having on the Lower Deschutes in terms of temperature management. And those conditions are really is what's partly affecting the change in algal growth and the change in the invertebrate community. Okay, let's see if we can move on. Seems like I'm losing control here again. There we go. This last one I want to talk about on temperature kind of addresses the comment that they're going to run out of cold water in Lake Billy Chinook if they release more cold water earlier in the year. If you look at this, these are two graphs of the depths of the reservoir in front of Round Butte Dam. And you can see here at 80 meters is about the depth of where the bottom water is drawn out of the reservoir into the Lower Deschutes if it's released from the bottom. And in 2006, you can see what that thermal decline looks like, or the temperature conditions look like at different depths, versus 2016 is when the tower was operating. So we're looking at before the tower and after the tower. And if you look at the August pre-tower bottom temperature at 80 meters, it's about 10 degrees centigrade. And if you look at that August post-tower bottom temperature, it's about 8 degrees centigrade instead of 10 degrees centigrade. And so it was cooler in 2016 after the tower started operating than it was in 2006. But it's still cold in 2006. It's 10 degrees centigrade. That's not warm water. But remember, you have to, see, I'm losing control here. What's happening? There we go. You must blend bottom with surface water now. They cannot release 100% bottom water. So if you blend surface water with bottom water, in 2016, the surface temperature was about 18 degrees centigrade. And if you blend 60% of bottom with 40% of that warm surface water, you'd have a temperature that's being released at 12 degrees centigrade. So in actual fact, it's a long way to get around to this, but based on the fact you have to mix bottom water with surface water now, the pre-tower temperature in 2006 that would have been released at 10 degrees centigrade is now in 2016 would have been 12 degrees centigrade. So they claim that they're holding on to this bottom water because they're going to run out of it. But in fact, because they're blending this warm surface water, the water released into the Lower Deschutes is actually warmer. So something to keep in mind when you hear that comment that they're going to run out of cold water. Another little bit of a confusing graph maybe, but I think we can make sense of it. This shows that the water they release at the tower when it's cooler will cool the Deschutes River all the way to the mouth. And the orange line here at the bottom is the water temperature at Moody at the mouth of the Deschutes. If you look at the dates, it starts, the graph starts in end of July and continues to early September. The blue line is air temperature in the Dalles over the same time period. And the red line represents changes in the amount of bottom water being released. So around August 10th, they went to maximum bottom draw from 30% bottom water to 65% bottom water. And during that time, the air temperature was increasing and the water temperature was still decreasing. And the decrease in water temperature is because they started releasing more bottom water that's colder. So the idea that the temperature of water released at the dam will affect the temperature all the way to the mouth. So it's really important how they do manage temperature and the water that's released at the dam, because it's going to have an effect on the Lower Deschutes River all the way to the mouth, even if the air temperature is warming. So it's very clear that can affect the river to the mouth. Okay, see if we can move on. Okay, let's go on to pH real quick. pH is a measure of the hydrogen ion concentration. You probably are familiar with this in terms of whether liquid is acidic or basic or alkaline. pH of 7 is neutral. Anything less than 7 is considered acidic, and higher than 7 is considered alkaline. pH standards are present in all the waters around the state of Oregon. Usually the minimum standard is nothing below 6.5, and the maximum is typically 8.5. The maximum standard on the Deschutes is set at 8.5. And violations of this standard have increased significantly since the tower started operating. Unfortunately, DEQ has ignored these violations. And it's due to the pH, due to the nutrients that are being released from Lake Billy Chinook. The nutrients lead to excessive algal growth, and the more plants and algal growth that you have in the stream, you have increased photosynthesis. And photosynthesis directly affects pH by the way it changes the water chemistry. So without getting into the chemistry, it's common that anytime you increase the amount of photosynthesis, you're going to see an increase in pH. And at night, when photosynthesis stops, you'll see a decline in pH. So pH is one of the better measures of when you have nutrient problems in a stream, because you'll get these elevated levels. Okay, and these large daily swings in pH as well as dissolved oxygen. So this graph shows data of pH collected at the Warm Springs Bridge, and it's collected by DEQ. So this is not our data. This is data collected by DEQ. They collect this data with a grab sample off the bridge, usually mid-morning, and they do it every other month. But we've got data from 1989 here until 2009. And that's when the tower started operating right here. And you can see that there were occasional areas, exceedances, points above this 8.5 line that's above the standard if it goes above 8.5. And it was about 3% of those samples exceeded the standard. But immediately starting after the tower started operating, you see a very distinct increase in those pH violations. And it's about 29% of the measurements violated the 8.5 standard. So using DEQ's data, you can see a real strong shift to higher pH, which is a result of the increased algal growth and the increased nutrients that's being released into the lower river. And this just shows, this is our own data. This is DRA data from 2022. And the important thing here is these little circles indicate periods when they had to suddenly release maximum bottom water because they were doing some maintenance work at the tower. So occasionally they have to do maintenance. There might be some debris or something at the tower, and they have to turn off as much of the surface water release as they can. And when they've done that, there's been a very noticeable and immediate drop in pH when they start releasing this maximum bottom water. So again, this shows that by altering the mix of water and increasing bottom water that's released from the tower, they can improve water quality in the Lower Deschutes River. We've seen it with temperature, and this shows that it also occurs with pH. Okay, last I want to talk about dissolved oxygen. You know, all organisms need oxygen, so same for aquatic organisms. And in water, dissolved oxygen is affected by the temperature of the water. Cold water can hold more dissolved oxygen than warmer water, so the colder water is better for DO. Turbulence increases the amount of dissolved oxygen because it entraps oxygen in the air, gets pulled into the water. And photosynthetic activity. So the more photosynthesis that's occurring, that releases oxygen into the water also. Salmon and trout are some of the most sensitive species to low DO. And the oxygen requirements are even greater for salmon and trout for the developing eggs and the sac fry that are in the gravel. So the standards that are set for dissolved oxygen are typically set to protect salmon and trout. And the standards are even more strict when salmon and trout are spawning and the eggs are in the gravel. We know that trout spawning in the Lower Deschutes River occurs over a long time period, at least February through the end of August, and probably even throughout the whole year. And in the initial permit that DEQ gave PGE for operating the tower, they specifically cited that salmonid spawning occurs year-round. DO violations are occurring during trout spawning, sometimes for well over a month, and we're going to show some information on that here in a second. There is a solution to this when dissolved oxygen gets low. They can spill water over the top of the re-regulation dam instead of running it through the turbines. And when they spill water, it creates a lot of turbulence, which increases dissolved oxygen in the lower river. Okay, let's go here. I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit. Okay, so these tables show what the standards are for dissolved oxygen. 11 is the basic standard for the minimum concentration of DO when salmon and trout are spawning and the eggs are in the gravel. And there's another level, a slightly less strict standard of 9 milligrams per liter that can be applied if you go out and you measure the level of oxygen in the gravel, in the substrate. And if that dissolved oxygen down in the substrate below the surface of the water is 8 milligrams or higher, then you're allowed a slightly lower minimum in the water column of 9 milligrams per liter. And when it's not spawning season, 8 milligrams per liter is the typical standard. Now in the Deschutes, DEQ has been applying the 9 milligram per liter standard during spawning and incubation periods. PGE has gone out and they've done intergravel DO measurements that appear to be above 8, so they've applied this 9. But in addition, during the non-spawning periods, DEQ has even allowed a more relaxed standard for dissolved oxygen, which is in the regulations, but it's typically, it's up to the discretion of DEQ to use this less strict one. And they've been applying that, which is based on 3 different levels of 8 milligrams per liter of a 30-day mean minimum, or a 6.5 level for a 7-day minimum mean, or a 6 milligrams per liter as an absolute minimum. Now, we think it's really inappropriate for DEQ to be using these lower standards, and in particular because trout spawning does not end as early in the season as what they're applying. They're saying trout spawning ends June 15th, and I'm going to show the next slide on that. They changed the original permit that said it would apply year-round to June 15th based on in these interim agreements that Sarah alluded to earlier. Now, if you look at the number of days that DO drops below the minimum standard for spawning, if you apply spawning to the shortened period of ending June 15th, there's, from our data that we've collected from 2016 through 2022, there's been 9 days that the spawning standard has been exceeded, which is not very many. But if you include the spawning that continues until September 1st, which we feel is a very appropriate and time frame, there would have been 358 days over the same period of time from 2016 to 22. when the DO standard was exceeded and too low, it was below 9 milligrams per liter. So you can see there's a big difference in how this standard would be enforced if you're applying it to end June 15th versus later in the summer, like September 1st. So DEQ has been ignoring these trout spawning requirements, and these violations are continuing. And we're going to be talking about shortly in this presentation about some upcoming rulemaking that's really important regarding these spawning season dates. And these dates got set back in 2004. DEQ is going through and looking at how to apply the DO standards, and they were getting information from ODFW, and they created maps. ODFW created maps of where and when salmon and steelhead spawn. And we're talking about salmon and steelhead here. And in the lower Deschutes, there's two different dates. From the dams down to the Warm Springs River, October to June 15th was identified as the spawning season for salmon and steelhead. And from Warm Springs to the mouth, Warm Springs River to the mouth, it's October 15th to May 15th. The OARs, which are the actual rules and the standards in Oregon's, say that besides these graphs or these tables, which show salmon and steelhead spawning, resident trout spawning, the standard should apply where and when trout spawning occurs, not based on these maps here, but wherever resident trout spawning occurs during the time of trout spawning is when that spawning standard for dissolved oxygen should apply. And unfortunately, DEQ has been applying this salmon and steelhead spawning season to the trout spawning. And for the first time in 20 years, DEQ is going through a rulemaking process, trying to update these maps and apply standards for both trout and salmon and steelhead, and updating how they're going to apply this. And this rulemaking is supposed to be finished in April, and they'll be going out to the public for public comment. And we really hope that people will pay attention to this, because once we see how they're going to be applying these rules or these standards, we want to make sure they're applied appropriately. Okay, last I want to talk a little bit about the changes that's occurred to aquatic invertebrates in the lower river because of these water quality changes. There's been a number of things that have occurred. There's been a decline in mayflies, stoneflies, and some caddisflies, which tend to be the more sensitive types of aquatic invertebrates to water quality. And there's been an increase in non-insects, primarily worms and snails, which are generally quite tolerant to poor water quality. The hatch timing, the time of year that different insects emerge into the adults, has changed because of the temperature shifts that have occurred in the river. And typically now, the hatches that anglers are familiar with occur 4 to 6 weeks earlier. For example, golden stones and salmonfly hatches now start in late April and peak in early to mid-May, which is a good month earlier than they did before the tower started operating. Other major hatches, PMDs, the pale morning duns, green drakes, March browns, yellow sallies, they all tend to emerge now between April and mid-June. And after mid-June, there really aren't nearly the number and abundance of hatches that used to occur. One of the obvious ones is the caddis hatch that was very common in the middle of the summer, July and August, the net spinning caddis. And if you were a longtime fisherman out there that fished the river 15, 20 years ago, and you camped along the river and you had your camp lantern on at night cooking dinner, you know what I mean by caddis stew, because there were so many caddis attracted to your lantern lights that your stew that you were cooking got plenty of caddis in it as well. And that just doesn't happen now. And that's just one very obvious difference that you can see if you've been out on the river much. There are some hatches now that are pretty rare. Mahogany dun hatch, which is a genus of mayflies, and the summer cranefly hatches have really shown, some very distinct dramatic declines. But overall, there's been some important shifts and negative shifts. There has been data that's been collected to document this as part of the permit and the license. PGE had consultants going out in 1999 to 2001 collecting benthic samples of invertebrates at multiple sites down the Lower Deschutes. And they repeated that sampling after the tower started operating. And in 2016, they released a study of those samples. And it's called the R2 study because the consultants was the R2 consultants. And so we've referred to it as the R2 study. And the report concluded that only minor changes of invertebrates occurred after tower operations started. And that may even indicate some slight improvement in the invertebrate communities as a result of water quality changes. Well, this raised some eyebrows, and DEQ's biologists looked at this report and sent a memo to PGE indicating some real concerns with the way the data was analyzed and the resulting findings. And just to kind of cite the bottom sentence here, they mentioned in this memo that very large increases in densities across what would be considered tolerant taxa indicates lower biological condition in the Lower Deschutes River after the tower started operating. So DEQ's review of this report contradicted kind of what was being said in it. And as a result, the Deschutes River Alliance hired a professor at Portland State University to take the same data, R2 data, and analyze it. And they did a very thorough statistical analysis, and their results summarized here showed that the macroinvertebrate communities below the dams appeared to be significantly different from the pre-tower communities. And it was a shift towards more non-insect taxa, more pollution-tolerant taxa, and less EPT taxa. EPT stands for mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies. So more pollution-tolerant and less pollution-sensitive taxa after the tower started operating. And that, again, significantly fewer mayflies, stoneflies, caddisflies in the spring, and significantly more tolerant taxa, which are mostly worms and snails, in the fall and spring samples. So the sampling that's been done also indicates an important and negative shift in the macroinvertebrates. The Deschutes River Alliance we've been continuing to collect macroinvertebrate samples, benthic samples, for a number of years, and we have reports on our website that summarize this. We've collected more data last year, and we'll be collecting it again this year. And we're the only folks out there now that's continuing to follow up by collecting benthic macroinvertebrate samples, and we're using the same protocols that DEQ uses. Okay, why is this happening? Well, again, the macroinvertebrates are shifting because the temperature shifted and because of the nutrients that's going downstream and changing the algal community to a large mats of nuisance algae. And it's really affecting the habitat quality for macroinvertebrates and the food quality that's present for macroinvertebrates. So it's a result of the warmer and more nutrient-laden water from Lake Billy Chinook that's going into the Lower Deschutes. And that, friends, is the water quality in invertebrates. And I'm going to turn it over to Steve Pribyl and let him talk about the fish conditions.
Thank you, Rick. I hope everybody can hear me. Sarah, do I have control now? Apparently I do. Well, thank you everybody for taking time out of your evening to attend our presentation. Similar to Rick Hafele, I'm one of the original members of the DRA board. I spent a 30-year career as a fish biologist with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. 22 of those years I spent working on the Deschutes. Sarah referenced the fact that I know every rock in the Deschutes River, mostly because I've hit every one of them with a drift boat or a power boat. I've probably been from Pine Tree to the mouth over 200 times. And I used to count the number of times that I'd run Whitehorse Rapids, and I lost count after 75. So I probably have hit every rock on the river. Okay, now I've got control. I'm just going to run through a few high points, then we'll get into a species by species look. You're going to hear me harp on two things continuously. One is higher temperatures, with PGE managing to the highest possible temperature in the summer. This creates unnecessary thermal stress on both fish and the whole aquatic ecosystem. Increases in some fish pathogens, which I'll talk about, two of them being one black spot, the other is Ceratodonova shasta. Increases in these pathogens are the result of both temperature and nutrient increase. Rick referenced the fact that nutrient increases resulted in large increases in non-insect taxa, snails and worms. That plays into the fish pathogens that I'll talk about. I'll go on to talk about some non-native invasive species that are now common in the Deschutes. Smallmouth and walleye, their presence is a direct result of temperature increases in the lower river. ODFW contends that higher temperatures may result in faster growth and larger juvenile salmonids. We contend that the available data don't support those claims, and that the negative unintended consequences because of temperature increase far outweighs that potential benefit, which doesn't appear to be real. So on a species by species basis, let's talk about spring Chinook first. They're major anadromous run in the Deschutes. They're popular and important. They're important to both sport anglers, because the fishery at Shears Bridge is one of the few places in Central Oregon, and maybe even largely in Oregon, where a sport angler has a very good chance of catching a spring Chinook from the bank. The spring Chinook are very important to the tribal fishers for both subsistence and ceremonial purposes. There's three different runs and three different origins of spring Chinook in the Deschutes. The wild spring Chinook, which are the controlling stock, all go up the Warm Springs River, with the exception of a very few that go into Shatite Creek on the reservation. Warm Springs National Fish Hatchery has a barrier dam, and they're able to count with precision the returning adults at that facility. So they're not estimated numbers, they're actual counts. There are also two hatchery stocks in the Deschutes: Round Butte Hatchery, which is PGE funded mitigation, releases spring Chinook, and Warm Springs National on the reservation also releases spring Chinook. Their releases are solely for harvest augmentation. Wild spring Chinook, the constraining stock, has shown drastic decline since the start of the Selective Water Withdrawal Tower operation. Round Butte and Warm Springs runs have been up and down, but again, the constraining stock of wild fish has been drastically low. As few as 42 adult returns have been counted since Selective Water Withdrawal Tower operation started, with some variability in the several hundred range. But 42 individuals is starting to look something like extinction. And it's a long ways from the management goals of 1,000 to 1,300 returning adults. So spring Chinook, wild spring Chinook in the Deschutes are troublingly low. Based on the available data, DRA believes that the problem with wild spring Chinook is the direct result of increases in a fish parasite called Ceratodonova shasta that causes mortality to both adults and juveniles. The disease increase is directly tied to large increases in one of the worms Rick was referencing, Manunukia speciosa, and that aquatic worm is the host organism for the disease from Serrata Nova Shasta. So let me describe the life cycle of sea Shasta. The Mananukia speciosa or M. speciosa is the host organism. It's, as you can see, only about a millimeter long, so they're small. It sheds an actinospore life history variant of Serrata Nova Shasta. That is what infects the vertebrate host, in this case, spring Chinook. The infected spring Chinook, in turn, sheds a myxospore stage, which reinfects the M. speciosa. DRA believes there's a straight line relationship between increases in Mananukia speciosa, Serrata Nova Shasta, and the problems with spring Chinook that we're seeing. This is actually a microscope photo of M. speciosa. That you can see they're very small. This disease has been been subject to a fair amount of study in the Deschutes. And in a study cooperated between Oregon State University and ODFW, found that caged juveniles in the Deschutes suffered very high mortality, directly attributable to Serrata Nova Shasta. The key to this is the increase in this guy, the M. speciosa. Serrata Nova Shasta was present in the Deschutes prior to Selective Water Withdrawal Tower operation, but the problems we saw then are nowhere near the magnitude we see now. There's been very, very high pre-spawning mortality of adult wild spring Chinook in the warm spring system. And we believe that that's a direct result of Serrata Nova Shasta infection. Fortunately, trout and steelhead appear to be largely resistant to sea Shasta. So let's move on to fall Chinook. ODFW continues to make run to the river estimates for fall Chinook based on Shear's trap counts and whole river red counts. Fall Chinook numbers are in a declining trend in the Deschutes since Selective Water Withdrawal Tower went into operation. I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about, and Rick referenced this, PGE's claim over the years that they need to save cold water in the bottom of Lake Billy Chinook for release in the fall, colder water in the fall for benefit of fall Chinook. DRA did a very in-depth analysis of that claim, and our conclusion was that the colder water that PGE now releases is of no biological benefit, and there's no biological justification for that management. And here's why we believe that. Back to the famous pink and blue graph of warmer water and colder water. In the context of fall Chinook, the PGE is claiming that this little bit of cooling benefits fall Chinook, which doesn't amount to much, as Rick pointed out, about 1 degree Fahrenheit. And in terms of fall Chinook run timing in the Deschutes, it's at the wrong time of year. The peak in cooling is about mid-September, somewhat before the bulk of fall Chinook are even present in the lower Deschutes, certainly before the onset of spawning, which is about mid-October. And again, the magnitude of that cooling is so slight that it would be difficult to place a biological benefit. The cooling is well before there's any eggs or incubating fry in the gravel. And there's also a body of science that said lowering incubation temperatures on anadromous fish juveniles is not necessarily good. So PGE's constant claims that they have to manage temperature the way they do to benefit fall Chinook doesn't stand up to the scrutiny that we've given it. And if there was any benefit from this temperature management scheme relative to fall Chinook, you would not expect to see a decline in fall Chinook adult returns to the Deschutes since Selective Water Withdrawal Tower operation has started. So on to summer steelhead. As you all know, wild summer steelhead have a multi-year juvenile life history pattern in the Deschutes. Wild juveniles spend up to several years rearing in the Deschutes. And the current conditions that we've outlined of water temperature increase, effects to aquatic insects, and a proliferation of a variety of algae and stock diatoms. Those conditions are concerning, as well as, which I'll talk about later, a proliferation of non-native predator species in the Deschutes. Wild summer steelhead in the Deschutes are critically low levels, and they have been for several years. There may be a slight improvement in wild numbers in the Deschutes for run year 22-23, which isn't concluded yet, but the initial data are slightly positive. Temperatures have affected steelhead angling in the Deschutes. Those steelhead fishermen in the crowd remember that angling was regulated with an early closure in 21 due to low numbers. And we had a late start because of concerns for low numbers in 22. Regulations for 23 will depend on ultimately what the wild escapement in for the 2022-23 run year is. And we also remember the hoot owl regulations a couple of years ago, where sport angling was actually closed after 2 p.m. during steelhead season. And that was directly due to high temperatures and concerns for stress on caught and released wild summer steelhead. That particular item could, as you've seen, be easily addressed through changes in tower management and releasing colder water. Let's move on to sockeye. Sockeye in the Deschutes were actually extirpated or caused to go extinct back in the 1900s. The sockeye that are present in the Deschutes now are solely the result of the reintroduction effort from PGE trying to reintroduce sockeye into the Deschutes. And there you see a sockeye. Reintroduction of sockeye above the dams has been disappointing, with average returns low, variable, and they appear to be decreasing. PGE's hope for sockeye reintroduction that the kokanee that are entrained behind Roundview Dam in Lake Billy Chinook would somehow turn into sockeye if they were allowed access to migrate and go to the ocean. And in fact, that's not happened. So sockeye don't, or excuse me, kokanee don't magically appear to want to turn into sockeye. So speaking of reintroduction, let's talk about the numbers of reintroduction. And here you see anadromous fish returns from the reintroduction effort, and these fish are known because of fin mark, returning to the Pelton trap. And this is for the period of record of adult returns from 2012 through 2022 for spring Chinook, steelhead, and sockeye. And you can see in the plot, steelhead in gray, spring Chinook in blue, sockeye in gold. With the exception of 1 year's return for steelhead all adult return numbers resulting from reintroduction have been below 100 individuals annually. For steelhead in 2022-23 run year, it's going to be a slight increase of about 130 individuals. So that's a little bit of an increase, but for the problems that we're seeing in the lower river from surface water withdrawal directed at reintroduction efforts, we certainly aren't seeing much. And remember that the reintroduction effort, the ultimate goal is to mitigate for losses caused by the dams, and Round Butte hatchery could go away and cease production of steelhead, summer steelhead, and spring Chinook. Now, I do have to explain this one point right here on the sockeye plot. In 2016, 538 adult sockeye returned to the Pelton Trap. That magnitude of return has never been repeated. I've heard people that know a lot more about sockeye than I do characterize that as a sweepstakes event or a lottery event or just a random event, but it's never been repeated. And even more importantly than that, even though that large number of spawners resulted in a big outmigration of juveniles in 2017, as measured at the Selective Water Withdrawal Tower trap facility, that large outmigration year did not translate into large adult returns of 3-year-old, 4-year-old, or 5-year-old sockeye in successive years. So that brood year of 2016 resulted in no increase in production. Again, I have to reference that sockeye or kokanee aren't sockeye. So let's move on to rainbow trout. I have to jab at my previous employer, ODFW, just a little bit with red band trout. ODFW didn't have a well thought out, well executed monitoring plan after Selective Water Withdrawal Tower operation started in 2010. And they did no monitoring of red band trout populations in the Deschutes, largely in response to DRA's concerns that we voiced relative to what we were seeing with red band trout. ODFW did one small grab sample and looked at a relatively small sample size, did some analysis of that, and in DRA's opinion, frankly, reached some conclusions that the data they possessed didn't support. We called them out on that, and to ODFW's credit, they now are repeating the historic sections where they estimate fish per mile and collect a variety of other biosampling data. Those samples in ODFW's work show that with some variation, the trout populations they're estimating are within the historic range of data. And I have to point out there's a long, robust data string on trout populations in the Deschutes going clear back into the 1970s. I helped collect a lot of that data in the 80s and early 90s. Their current data show that growth rate, size at age, and condition factor, which is a measure of a fish's robustness, length versus weight, are similar to historic values.
Right.
Diet, however, seems to have shifted slightly away from aquatic insects. And Rick's presentation on aquatic insects, I think, would suggest that their aquatic insect food source has been impacted. So obviously they've had a tendency to shift away from things that aren't there to things that are there. ODFW's work suggests, as well as some observations DRA has made, that there's an indication that spawn timing for red bands in the Deschutes is shifting earlier in the year. If you remember back to the pink and blue graph, all of that warm water in the winter and early spring has got to have an effect on spawn timing. But having said that, red band trout spawning in the Deschutes takes place over a long period of time, potentially every month of the year. So DRA is happy that red bands appear to be doing okay. And we're thankful that ODFW is keeping their finger on the pulse. But we're also nervous about trout in the Deschutes. We're nervous about the decline in aquatic insects. And we're nervous about increased predator load, which I'll talk about more later. Black spot disease, for those of you that fish trout in the Deschutes a lot, you've noticed this increase in black spots on the red bands, become much more prevalent since selective water withdrawal tower operation. Basically, any red band over age 2 has black spot, and it was never found in the Deschutes prior to selective water withdrawal tower operation. So here is black spot, and these out of place black spots, usually on the belly, can also be on the head. Those are a pigment response to an irritation that the fish suffers when the black spot organism, Deschutes, actually bores into the fish and causes an irritation. So here's the life cycle of black spot, which the Deschutes organism is actually the causative agent. As opposed to Ceratodonova shasta, this life cycle actually involves a vertebrate host, a mammalian host. In the Deschutes, it's probably not a loon, but rather osprey, great blue heron, kingfisher, merganser, and a more complex life history cycle where a couple different life history stages eventually infect a snail. And the increase in this snail is what has accounted for the increase in the life history stage that exits the snail and bores into the trout. So the increase that you're seeing in black spot on trout is directly tied to the increase in snails, which is directly tied to the increase in nutrient load, which favors that organism. ODFW tends to characterize black spot as something like pimples on an adolescent human. I tend to characterize it more as a symptom of an aquatic ecosystem that's completely out of balance. And the other thing that black spot always caused me to do was worry about what's next. If we've seen increases in Ceratodonova shasta, we've seen increases in black spot, both resulting from increases in nutrient load. Well, what's next? I don't lay awake at night and worry about a lot, but when I do, I worry about whirling disease in the Deschutes. Whirling disease is actually transported into North America from Germany way back when. There were some large increases in subsequent fish die-offs in some of the intermountain states from whirling disease. It's a disease of concern. It has a complex multi-host life cycle. The important one for the purposes of this discussion is item number 2 here, which is a tubifex worm. The actual name is tubifex tubifex. It is a host for the spore. The triactinomyxin spore stage is released from tubifex. It infects rainbow trout. Rainbow trout, steelhead, sockeye, and whitefish are all susceptible to whirling disease. Now, whirling disease is in the Deschutes. Tubifex worms are in the Deschutes. There's been a fair amount of research done on this leading up to the start of the reintroduction effort. And the one particular tubifex worm that is most likely to host Myxosoma is found both above and below the dam complex. Caged juveniles in Trout Creek have actually contracted whirling disease. So Myxosoma cerebralis, the actual agent of the disease, is in the Deschutes. It's thought to have come from stray steelhead entering the Deschutes from the Snake River systems of the Lostine and the Grand Ronde, where the disease is known to exist. So nutrient enrichment is the common theme that you're hearing here with all of these increases in intermediate hosts. Now, the problem with whirling disease is if the tubifex worm decides to follow the same trajectory of increase that we're seeing from in Stratonova Shasta's intermediate host and black spot intermediate host, it's not going to be good in the Deschutes. The literature that's available in the Deschutes tends to suggest that what's keeping whirling disease at bay right now is low populations of tubifex and a patchy distribution of tubifex. But again, the literature also is very clear that tubifex responds positively to increases in nutrient and increases in temperature. The two things that we're seeing throughout discussions of all of these items. So when I lay awake at night and worry about the Deschutes, whirling disease and tubifex are the things that cause me to lay awake at night and worry. So let's move on to something that's not quite so worrisome, and that's our non-native species, which have increased in abundance in the Deschutes. These are smallmouth bass you see here on the top. Smallmouth bass were very, very rare in the Deschutes prior to Selective Water Withdrawal Tower operation and the warming that is taking place. I personally fished the Lower Deschutes for over 40 years before I caught my first smallmouth bass. I spent a lot of time electrofishing in the Deschutes and never saw a bass. They're now common up to about river mile 14, July, August, and September. They're migrating up out of the Columbia in response to the warmer water. And they leave when the water gets cooler. They don't appear to be reproducing in the Deschutes, to which I say, so what? They're present there now when they never were before. And it's their presence is directly attributable to warmer water. And walleye were never documented in the Lower Deschutes prior to warmer water caused by Selective Water Withdrawal Tower operation. This walleye my wife is holding wasn't caught in the Deschutes, but it was caught right off the mouth of the Deschutes. So that concludes my part of the presentation. I'll return control back to Derek, and we'll move on. Derek, are you going to assume control?
All right. I think I got control now here. We'll see actually. All right. All right. So I'm going to start wrapping things up here. And just talk real quick what the future of the Lower Deschutes is if changes are not made to the Selective Withdrawal Tower operations. This will also serve as a good review of everything that we've covered so far. So if changes aren't made, we're going to continue to see excessive violations of the water quality standards. The this decline in water quality has continued to contribute to the growth and production of nuisance algae. Both this poor water quality and high nuisance algae is going to favor high levels of fish pathogens, which, as we already covered, is very concerning. The poor water quality and also the increased and nuisance algae is going to continue to contribute to the lower numbers of sensitive aquatic insects, including mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies. This poor overall abundance, sorry, the lights went out there, is going to continue to impact aquatic life and terrestrial life that depend upon these insects for food. One example being fewer insectivore birds along the lower river. And additionally, the continued use of the flawed temperature model that maximizes the temperature of water being released into the lower Deschutes is going to continue to cause unnecessary thermal stress to aquatic life. And this is going to, be continually exacerbated as we see the climate change. And lastly, reintroduction of salmon and steelhead above the project will continue to fail, which I would say no one wants to see that. All right, so there's been a lot of, negative topics we've covered. Unfortunately, they're all the current state of the Lower Deschutes, but we're going to shift into more of a positive side of things and what can be done to fix the problems. So I'm going to start with a larger management perspective, and then I'll transition into what you as an individual can do to advocate for the Lower Deschutes. All right, so what can be done? So first and foremost, we need to lower the nutrient load entering the Lower Deschutes River. Remember, the surface water from the Selective Withdrawal Tower is causing excess nutrients, primarily sourced from the Crooked River, to enter the Lower Deschutes. And this is a major source of the algal and water quality problems that we've been seeing, particularly with the pH. We also need to stop utilizing the current flawed temperature model that allows for the release of maximum temperature into the Lower Deschutes. This model that PGE has used is contributing to the negative shifts that we've seen in the algal and macroinvertebrate species communities, and is also not helping water quality, or other water quality parameters. How are we going to do this? Well, the answer is pretty simple, fortunately. We need to maximize cold water releases from the bottom of Lake Billy Chinook. So we need to take the cool, clean water that's primarily sourced from the Deschutes River and put that into the Lower Deschutes. The DRA advocates for maximum cold water releases year-round, except for the peak out-migrating juvenile salmonid period of March 15th to June 15th. But one thing I want to highlight again is there is the limitation of the maximum number of cool, clean water being released from the bottom of the reservoir of 60%. So even though maximizing cold water release will cause the much needed relief that we are advocating for, we likely aren't going to see a reversion to pre-tower conditions due to that limitation of there always being at least some portion of surface water being released. And this is how this is going to happen. Well, regulatory agencies, DEQ needs to do their job and require that these operational changes be met. They need to require PGE and the project operators to make these changes in order to meet the water quality standards set to protect aquatic life in the lower river. All right, what about watershed restoration? So this is a really important topic, and especially in the upper basin, is something that the DRA does advocate for. And this is largely because a lot of the issues that are facing the Lower Deschutes River is directly tied to poor water quality and habitat conditions in the upper river, particularly with the Crooked River. However, with all of that being said, restoration will be needed on a scale not seen before in Oregon, and not only this, but it's likely going to take decades to improve water quality if it works. So essentially, it's not going to solve the short-term problems facing the Lower Deschutes River, and it shouldn't be viewed as a solution to the immediate problems that we're seeing there. As we shared throughout this presentation, the available data record shows that the clear solution to the Lower Deschutes River's problems is maximizing cold water releases from the bottom of Lake Billy Chinook. All right, so that was more of a bigger picture, and now we're going to transition into what you can do for the Lower Deschutes River. So Really exciting. For the first time in 20 years, the aquatic life use maps are being updated. Rick covered that map a little bit earlier in the presentation during the dissolved oxygen portion. So essentially these maps detail when and where water quality standards for dissolved oxygen and temperature apply. Fortunately, the Deschutes River Alliance is a member of the Rules Advisory Committees, so we are receiving continual updates throughout this process, and we are advocating for stricter water quality standards in the Lower Deschutes River and all of Oregon's watersheds. Remember, Rick mentioned that when we covered the dissolved oxygen, that the standards as currently applied are not adequately protecting trout spawning in the Lower Deschutes River. So in order to make sure that this happens, there's a public comment period that's scheduled to open sometime this month in which you can make your voice heard and advocate for this to occur. However, it's already been postponed twice. So if you haven't already, please follow us on social media and subscribe to our emails in order to stay informed and make your voice heard. So that concludes the presentation. I'll open it up to questions in just a little bit. But if after all of this, you still have questions or want additional information, I encourage you all to review our 2022 water quality report. A lot of work was put into that, and it details everything we covered and even more. So it's going to be posted to our website tomorrow. And if you have questions, you can always reach out to me at my email, which is my name, Derek, at DeschutesRiverAlliance.org. So I'll open it up to questions. I'd ask if anyone would like to ask the question over on the microphone, please raise your hand. You should be able to do this in the toolbar of Zoom. And we're also going to be reviewing the chat for questions. I saw some questions pop up throughout the presentation. You can type it in there now as well, and we'll try to get to it. So I apologize, we went quite a bit over time, but for those of you who stuck around, we'll start running through the questions. I don't know, Sarah, do you want to, let's see, and pull up the chat here.
Oh, you're done speaking.
Right. Let's see, here's one. So Steve Erickson asks, is cladophora problematic? Let's see. And if it's problematic, is it because of temperature issues? And will it be, essentially it sounds like he's asking if temperature is better managed, if the cladophora will become less of a problem.
I can probably speak to that a little bit, Derek.
Yeah.
So cladophora is present in the Lower Deschutes. It has increased. A few years ago was a particularly large boom of it, but the algae that's causing some of the bigger problems, there's two species of diatoms that create that snot-like surface. It's not, some of you might be familiar with Didymo, that is an invasive diatom that's present in Montana and many streams and is causing problems. It's not that. There are two native species of diatoms, but they've increased following the changes in the conditions in the river. So cladophora is an issue that probably will crop up from time to time, but the bigger issues are these two diatom species. I think improving the water quality is going to reduce those problems. How much would remain to be seen?
Thanks, Rick. All right, another question we have here is the desire from Jeremy Hole. Is the desire to collect salmonids at surface water the number one reason to have higher water temperature released?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Is it the number one desire? There's two reasons that are cited in the license for releasing surface water. One is collecting salmonids at the trap, and that's a big part of it, no question. And the other was for water quality management, but the water quality management's not working out as they anticipated when they developed when they wrote the permit and the FERC license. But yeah, the key factor in surface water currents and surface water release is trying to collect salmonids at the trout.
Excellent. Sorry, I'm reading through this question from George Saunders. Are you here, George? Maybe you can clarify this question for us here a little better.
I think I see what he's saying is, can 30 to 40% surface water move the migrating fish instead of releasing 100% bottom water or 100% surface water? Can you get by if you're just releasing 30% surface water? And they're already having trouble with the current being strong enough to attract fish adequately. So I don't think 30% surface water releases would create the kind of currents they need. So unfortunately, yeah, I don't think 30% surface water releases would work for collecting fish.
Right, and they drop it down to that when they do maintenance. I think there's always at least 30
and
to
in
40%.
August, in the late summer and fall, they're releasing just 30%, or 40%, 60% bottom, 40% surface in the fall, late summer and fall.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, and the next question by Mark looks like it's asking if PGE could redirect the surface water back into Lake Billy Chinook in order to maximize bottom draw. So I'm not really sure. There must be some engineering limitation to where I don't think that's possible. I think whatever's taken in from the top must be released into the lower Deschutes. Rick, I don't know if you know.
That's water that they're generating power with.
Right.
So they wouldn't be amenable to redirecting that water back into the reservoir. That's hydroelectric generation.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just reading this next question here. Sorry, it's a long one here.
I read ahead a little there, and I'll answer the last question. And the smolts could be trapped at the head of the reservoir and all three tributaries. It's physically possible to do that. DRA has advocated for that. And you wouldn't catch them all, but you could catch a fairly large percentage of them. DRA has advocated for that, and PG has rejected those ideas out of hand.
We have a couple of folks who have raised their hands. Why don't we see what Hank Robb would like to ask?
Hi, a couple of things. First of all, I can't imagine who in the world thought that this would not result in warming water below the dam, and that there wouldn't be the outcome that we're having when this was originally proposed. So that's just wandering around in my head. But the second thing, and I can also understand if nobody really wants to answer this, is PGE made plenty of money when water came right out of the bottom of the dam. Why are they having a hard time? Because it's not going to affect their bottom line, as far as I can tell, doing things that would actually make a difference here.
It'd be a good question to ask PGE, Hank.
Thank you.
Well, I'll chime in on that. I mean, Hank, we've asked PGE over and over why they don't modify selective water withdrawal to operation as we've suggested. Only draw water off the surface during the juvenile migration period, and do that at night when, number one, the juveniles are migrating, And number two, temperatures are lower. And the only answer we've ever gotten is, well, they're following the license.
Again, thank you.
Let's take a question from Kevin next, please.
Mine was very similar. I was trying to find out what the financial benefit of doing it the same way Rob was. Is there's got to be a reason PGE doesn't want to do this, and it's got to be financial. So anybody have any insight on that?
Nope, not from what I know.
They don't let us look at their books.
Thanks. I'm just surprised they haven't shared it a little bit, but appreciate it.
We have a couple of questions about the nutrient load. One, how do you define nutrient load? And then another, you talked about increased nutrients in the river changing pH. What are they specifically? Fertilizers?
So the specific nutrient that's causing problems is nitrogen. And certainly fertilizers is one of the sources of nitrogen. You know, animal feedlots, animal operations along the river, up above or part of it. So nitrogen is the concern. And it's measured by taking water column samples and looking at the levels of the different constituents of nitrogen, nitrate, nitrite, ammonia, as well as phosphorus, which is another important nutrient. Central Oregon in general, because of the geology, is high in phosphorus. In many other parts of the country, you would hear phosphorus being the major nutrient of concern and why you want to use low phosphate washing detergent and so forth. But in the Central Oregon and the Deschutes, nitrate is the limiting nutrient in terms of plant growth and algal growth. So, and the biggest source of nitrogen is the Crooked River. There's been plenty of data collected at the mouth of the Crooked and the mouth of the Deschutes and the mouth of the Metolius coming into Lake Billy Chinook. And the Crooked River is significantly higher in nitrogen than the other two. So the fact that Crooked River water is warmer and floats on the surface and goes down into the Lower Deschutes when they release surface water is increasing that nitrogen load in the Lower Deschutes. If you measure nitrogen itself in the water column, it gets confusing because in the summer when you have large algal blooms, those nitrogen levels will drop to almost below detection because all the algal and plant growth is consuming it. So that's why pH is such an important measure of nutrient problems, because the pH is reflecting that increased algal and plant growth. And as you get the increased algae and plant growth, you get these high pH levels. And so you can't just rely on going out and measuring nitrogen levels in the water column to understand what's happening with nutrients. But we know the Crooked River is the source of the problem in the surface water in Lake Billy Chinook.
Hank, Rob, did you have another question or is your hand just still up from your previous one?
No, I'm unfortunately endlessly full of questions, even if I don't remember them all at the same time. So thank you for giving me another shot here. People who go to work in government and organizations like DEQ usually don't do it so they can violate or not go after people who are violating the regs. So, and my thought is something has to come from the top here. Does anybody understand why these various governors who have been heading the government of the state have not pursued getting the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality to do its job? Are there large donations made by PGE or executives of PGE, or does anybody track? I mean, I just don't understand the puzzle here.
So I'll
I-
take that one with a couple of others, actually, if that's okay. So we don't know why DEQ does what it does or doesn't do what it does. They are an agency that does not appear to want to enforce the Clean Water Act on the Lower Deschutes at this time. And that's extremely frustrating to us. There's a question in the chat which asks, what's the status of our litigation against DEQ, PGE, et cetera? We did have a Clean Water Act lawsuit that we filed against PGE. The Warm Springs tribe inserted themselves into the lawsuit. And at the end of the day, before the science was ever heard, and the case was really heard in court, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals 2 years ago ruled that the tribe has sovereign immunity, and therefore we don't have a lawsuit that we can pursue against PGE at this time. And we're looking into other avenues, legal and otherwise, to pressure DEQ, if not downright force them to do their jobs and enforce the Clean Water Act. I see, why is DEQ failing to comply? I think I just kind of answered that. And then another question, Mark Jacobson asks, I assume they have to do top draw and fish passage to meet requirements of the FERC license, right? That's actually not true. The tower is part of their FERC license, but they could, if they wanted to, limit the amount of surface draw that they do in utilizing the tower for fish reintroduction. PGE published a multi-year report around 3.5 years ago. And the science in it, we agreed with a lot of the science. And, you know, we could be nitpicky. We could pick apart things here and there, but overall, our science team really agreed with this report. And in this report were some scenarios, one of which really caught our attention. It's called the night blend scenario. And what the night blend scenario would do would have maximum bottom draw of 60%, 365 days a year, 24/7, with the exception of March 15th to June 15th, from, I believe it's 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. in the morning, when they know smolts, the juveniles, are migrating. So they would do maximum surface draw then. The rest of the time, they could do the 60% bottom draw. This would not affect energy production. This would not affect the fish reintroduction program, and it would not affect their FERC license. But we don't know why they don't want to do that. It's one of the things that's very frustrating for myself and other people involved with the DRA. It just doesn't make sense. And I wish I had an answer, but I don't. So does anyone else have any questions?
If I might, just one more time, would you go over the sovereign immunity issue?
So the Warm Springs tribe, they're seeing their own nation. So they have sovereign immunity, and we're not able to sue them in federal court because they are their own nation.
And because they are part of the dam.
They're part owners of the dam, yes.
That's why you can't do anything about the operation of the dam?
So when we filed the lawsuit, we filed it against PGE as the operators of the dam, but then the tribe as co-owners inserted themselves. And when they did that, it took the case off its rails.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just lost power and our house went out. I don't know if PG was listening to me or not, but power went out.
Well, Rick, you do live in Salem, and they tell me that's where the Pelton Round View power goes to.
No, I have Pacific Power as my power company. But...
Oh, okay. Okay.
Hey, Sarah, I see a specific question from Rick Foster that I can answer quickly.
Good.
Chris asks, what is the estimated number of trout per mile in the Lower Deschutes? It varies depending on location, between about 1,500 and about 3,500. More trout higher in the river, generally less trout lower in the river, but it's in that 1,500 to 3,500 all sizes per linear mile.
Okay, with that, I think we've actually answered all the questions in the chat. Although Chris Foster did ask, is it time to declare the SWW project a failure? And I don't know how you can watch this presentation and not declare it a failure. But that's where we're at. And the project, the tower is part of their license. It's part of how they got the new license, and they do need to use it. But as I said before, they can use it in a different way and to the benefit of the lower river. So with that, I think we're ready to wrap things up. We really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us tonight. We know this was a lot of information, but we also know that this is exceptionally important information, and it really highlighted the work that we've been doing for the last decade or more to protect a river that we all love. And that, quite frankly, if this is allowed to happen on an iconic, world famous, wild and scenic river like the Lower Deschutes River, it scares me to think of where else it can happen. And we need to continue to fight for this river and really work to give it what it deserves, which is cool, clean water. So thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you coming out tonight. And if you have any further questions, feel free to email Derek, or you can email myself at Sarah with an H at DeschutesRiverAlliance.org. We're happy to field questions from our supporters or just folks that want to ask questions at any time. So feel free to reach out, and we appreciate you coming out tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming out.